Well, good morning. I'm with James Arnold. It's March 23rd, 2012, and we're in New York City. And welcome, Mr. Arnold. I'd like to start out with you talking a little bit about how life's path got you to where you are today, the CEO of your own consulting group, Arnold Consulting Group. So just talk a little bit about that. How did you get here?
Well, thank you, Cindy, and thanks a lot for inviting me to be here. Well, I started off to be an English lit professor, and along the way I got sidetracked. I had an assistantship and teaching assistantship at Vanderbilt in the graduate school on English lit, and while I was there I began doing historical research, another love of mine, for the Hermitage, Andrew Jackson's home on the outskirts of Nashville. And I had the good fortune to publish a number of articles, and it was an exciting thing for me because I had direct access to Jackson's papers. I could actually sit in his office, go through his notes, go through his papers. He even had a traveling liquor cabinet that we put in the coach that he was riding in, and I could open that, and one day I found myself sniffing his brandy bottle to see if I could smell any brandy in there. And so clearly I was excited by the physical proximity and the actual authenticity of looking at those documents. And I found that at that time, which is before the National Endowment for the Humanities had come along and nurtured all of these kinds of things, that there was a lot of really good, rich, textured things to be found and written about. And I wrote about a number of them, and as a result of that, I ended up never really completing my academic cycle, always going to finish that dissertation and get it done, but I was writing and doing something else that I like. That brought me into the circle of a man named John Siegenthaler, who was the editor of the Tennessean at that time, later the publisher, and then eventually the first editor of USA Today after Gannett bought the Tennessean. And he was a lover of history, and he read some of the things I wrote, and he began to ask me to write stuff for the Sunday magazine of the Tennessean, and I would. And then I ended up having a gig on the noon show there, which was a television show on the NBC affiliate on Middle Tennessee history, and I would go on and do a walkabout and tell people about things that were of interest. And as a result of doing that, kind of out of the blue, in 1966, when I was still in graduate school, not yet out, I was asked to work on a gubernatorial campaign that Mr. Siegenthaler had a big interest in Tennessee. And I did. I became an issues writer. I did a lot of the issues research. Our candidate lost, but he lost in the primary. So in '68, when Robert Kennedy decided to run for president, John Siegenthaler had been Robert Kennedy's press secretary. And he asked me if I wanted to go to Northern California and handle media in Northern California for Kennedy. And I said, sure. I mean, I was all of 26 or 27 and I had never really handled anything like that, but I thought, how hard could it be? And while there, I got to know Jess Unruh, who was at that time the chairman of the Kennedy campaign for the state of California, former Speaker of the Assembly. Later, after losing to Ronald Reagan, became the treasurer of the state, but was kind of a legendary character and a political figure. He was running the campaign, and I ended up being attached to him. He was my boss in that part of California. So I became very involved in political activities in the Democratic Party, and of course the Kennedy campaign ended very sadly. I went back to Tennessee, kept on doing research, and soon another campaign came along in 1970, same candidate for governor, so I worked again, we lost again. This time everybody lost. The real Al Gore, as we call him, was Al Gore Jr.'s father. Al Gore Sr. lost to a Republican from East Tennessee, and Howard Baker had already been elected to the Senate, taking Estes Kefauver's seat. My candidate for governor lost, so we had in Tennessee, for the first time since Reconstruction, a Republican governor, and we also had 2 Republican United States senators. So I was a little bit at loose ends, and Tennessee is an oddity of the states. It's the only state where the president of the Senate of the state is also the lieutenant governor under the Constitution. So you're a real senator. You have a vote, you have appointing powers and everything, as the president of the Senate does in most states. But in Tennessee, you're automatically made the lieutenant governor. So I got a call one day from this man whom I barely knew, who said, I'm thinking about running for governor, and he was then the lieutenant governor, the highest ranking Democrat left in statewide office. And he said, would you like to work for me on my staff and we can develop a plan? I did. I organized political campaigns for the legislature. We had in '72 an unfortunate nomination at the federal level when McGovern ran in Tennessee. George Wallace actually won the Democratic primary. So we had to organize legislative campaigns to outside the traditional lines of the Democratic Party. So we created an organization to do that. I ran that organization. We kept control of the legislature, but the Democratic Party in the state lost a lot of seats and was pretty well decimated. In short order, I was elected president of the Young Democrats of Tennessee, and I became the official unpaid executive director of the Democratic Party. And my job in that was to put together a campaign for someone who could regain one of the Senate seats. And I did that. That man's name was Jim Sasser, and he became senator from Tennessee shortly thereafter. My boss said to me, I don't want to run for governor. I've changed my mind. I'm going to support someone else. I was getting a divorce. Jess Unruh called me out of the blue and said, we have founded a national organization whose mission is to improve state legislatures, and it's private sector based. It has a few legislators involved, but most of the people come from organized labor or from Common Cause, or they come from the League of Women Voters. They're academicians, they're newspaper people. Would you like to talk to us about working for us? And I said, sure, why not? I'm available. Interestingly enough, they had a terrific job, and now I'll hit the road. The job was that they had received grant number 3 from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And that grant was to create in 10 states what was called a Model Committee Staff Project in Health. These would be 10 states that had no history of using professional staff in the legislature. So they were really dependent on the executive branch of the government for information. And they were states where traditionally the legislature was viewed as kind of like the board of directors, and the governor was the CEO, and the CEO kind of proposed and the legislature disposed. And it was a rubber stamp, is the term often used. And we picked those 10 states on purpose because we wanted a demonstration that would be real. Not to go to a state like Illinois or California or New York that already had staff and a long history of having staff, but to really go to states where there was a clear agenda, where there were health issues, public health issues in the state that needed to be addressed. And this was a terrific program. I was hired to be its manager. I had a staff of 20 people in 10 state capitals. And out of this program, we passed the first HMO enabling legislation in the country in 9 of those states. We passed the first EMS legislation, creating statewide EMS systems, and a whole host of other very innovative certificate of need legislation, area health education center legislation. All of those things are very important at the state level. And the purpose of this project, of course, was to try to demonstrate to people that the legislature could do much more to fulfill its equal branch, as it were, to the executive or to the judicial in terms of making policy in the states. I mean, legislatures, after all, are the place where they grant you your birth decree and your death certificate. So from the day you're born till the day you die, states do a lot to control the quality of life for people who live there. I rose through the ranks of this organization, became its executive director, and at one time was leading a staff of people who were working in 30 different states. We were working on alcoholism, on drug abuse, on juvenile justice issues. Our mission was not to lobby a state, but was to give them the professional tools. They selected the staff ultimately. We pre-qualified them. They worked for them, but they had to agree to certain process improvements in the way the legislature worked. Both the minority and the majority party had to sign the contract. They had to work as joint committees, not as separate committees, working at cross purposes with each other. They had to have citizen involvement. They had to have hearings, and we had to be able to see all of that. I got very interested then in sort of the cause of, I guess the best way to say it's legislative improvement. That was my first big philosophical undertaking, was to try to convince people that how the laws get made are as important as what laws get made, because that process affects all the laws. And if one interest group can somehow or the other steamroll a legislative body to get legislation passed, 2 years later another interest group can steamroll it back the other way. Something that will be important when I talk about one of my largest clients later on in the National Congress. So after a period of time, funding began to change for organizations like this one. The Congress passed much stricter tax laws so that where we used to get a lot of soft money from the Ford Foundation or from Carnegie, as opposed to grant-specific money, dried up. And in addition to that, we had a contract from Ford to try to merge the three significant membership organizations made up from the legislatures themselves. There was a leaders organization, there was a rank and file member organization, and then there was a staff organization for all 50 of the state legislatures. And our contract was to merge them all into what today is the National Conference of State Legislatures, NCSL, which is the trade association for America's 50 legislatures. Once we had finished that contract, we decided, the board did, I think using very good judgment, to go out of business. Unruh, I think, said it best. He said, you know, we used to say that the legislatures of America were the sleeping 800-pound gorilla, and our job was to wake them up. And he said, but now that I look back on it, I think the further job remaining is who's going to civilize them now? Now that they're awake, how are we going to civilize them? I decided then to become a consultant. And the industries that are most regulated at the state level are those that are clearly at hand: alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and insurance. And I had developed fairly good relationships with some of the professional organizations who were involved in the regulation of insurance at the state level. And one of them wanted to create, in the 10 federal regions, they wanted to create a public affairs capability. They wanted to put public relations people there to work with their lobbyists in a way to shape public opinion with regard to the environment in which decisions were made about state-regulated insurance. So they gave me my first contract as a consultant, and I organized the public affairs program for the Alliance of Insurers. And as a result of doing that, it's funny, I've had good fortune in this way. The other two trade associations, there were the stock companies, the mutual companies, and then the independent companies. They all used more or less what are called the independent agents to sell their insurance. And those are small family businesses, usually with the big I. Their problem was that they were losing market share to what are called the direct writers, where the sales force is actually employed by the insurance carrier itself. And the reason this was important is because the marketplace in which insurance was being sold, property casualty insurance we're speaking of specifically, which has great societal consequences. The issues of redlining, for instance, grow out of property casualty insurance, as does gender-based rating for automobile insurance grew out of that industry. So there are a lot of societal dimensions to what they do and to the way they do their business. They were concerned because as their market was changing, there were these undercurrents of unrest, and it was sometimes important in states out west in particular to have to run a campaign. Somebody would put on the ballot an issue instructing the commissioner of insurance in their state to change the way automobile risks were rated, to eliminate gender bias in it at all. And so the companies would have to decide then, are we going to fight that, or are we going to go along with that? What should be our decision? But what was changing it most was technology. Increasingly, the companies wanted to sell more than just insurance. They wanted to be able to sell financial services. They wanted to be a financial services company. That's why today you will find Prudential, for instance, one of my earliest clients used to be Prudential Property and Casualty, and today the entire company is just called Prudential Financial Services. That marketplace was changing. So they wanted somebody to devise a plan that would keep the independent insurance agents strong and help them to recover market share. And I gave them a proposal to do that, which basically was to run an integrated advertising and public relations campaign across all the 50 states. I raised the funding from the carriers, about $25 million pledged by the carriers, and then the independent agents themselves pledged another $5 million. So we had $30 million to start with. I came to New York, hired an agency, picked a spokesperson. The spokesperson was Raymond Burr, who's his first client product that he'd ever endorsed, and we used his image, obviously, both as Ironsides and as Perry Mason in the advertising. And I wrote the tagline that was used, the more than one company agent, to try to play up the credibility of the independent agents. During that time, I got to know Chester Berger. I had met Chet before at a program for the insurance industry at which he was a speaker. We become friendly with each other, and I needed a place to work while I was in New York. And in fairly short order, Chet reorganized my priorities. I began using his office, and then he asked me. He kept saying, "Well, what will you do when Perry Mason is through?" I mean, you can only do Perry Mason for so long. And I knew he was right about that, because what I discovered is that I have a genuine love for, I guess, the pursuit of new business, the pursuit of a project, the pursuit of a challenge. I was good at building up an organization. I was good at finding grantors to support it. I'm good at recruiting people, good at selling an idea. But I wasn't so good at just doing the routine maintenance of stuff, you know, month after month or year after year. And I knew he was right, because I was becoming rather bored of it. You know, for one thing, I learned how large the ego of somebody like Raymond Burr can be. And when you have to worry about whether or not the scotch bottles in his room are the right size or not, after a while you start thinking, you know, I think there must be a more sane way to make a living than this. And so I had a contract. I wasn't an employee of the organization, and in time I just let the contract go, and I pursued a contract with the lodging industry, who were interested in what amounted to, built around Memorial Day, National Vacation Week, to promote travel. And so I stayed in Chet's office, and I put that program together, and it was fun when I just assembled the resources, got the ideas going, actually got a proclamation out of the White House and through the Congress, you know, to make this National Travel Week. I think it's Travel Month now, I think. And Chet and I became good friends, and he began to ask me if I wanted to work on a project, help him with a project. And I did. I learned a lot from him, and I enjoyed the association a lot. In time, I became a partner in his firm, and then as he anticipated retirement, he asked me to take over as the CEO of the company, and I did so, and eventually I bought out his interest in the business, and he left. And so that would have been in 1991 when I changed the name of the company at his insistence, in fact, from Chester Berger and Company to Arnold Consulting. Since he was not going to be remaining in the business but was of counsel, he said he really didn't want to have his name, I guess, just existing and in perpetuity in a business that he wasn't responsible for. And his very good advice to me was, and he said, besides that, you're selling yourself. And he said, you know, you shouldn't be selling yourself using my name on the door. You really need to put your name on the door and do it that way. And that's the story of how I got to be, at least through 1991, and I've continued to do pretty much the same thing. We built Arnold Consulting Group up. At one time I had around 30 people, all of them senior consultants, in the same way that Chet had always done it. He never wanted to bring anybody to work on a client who hadn't had a lot of time in place and had basically been there and done that, because what he wanted to sell for a client was that we hear you, we understand what you're dealing with, we've dealt with it before, we understand it, and our people will help you solve your problem. And his way of doing that was to always listen well to what the client said, and then assemble a team of people from within the organization that had relevant experience, and then wait for the light bulb to go off, which always was. He was not big on promoting. So he didn't, his idea wasn't that you get the client in the room and then you beat up on the client by how great your people are and who all you've done this for. He's much more the kind of person who would say, as he always did in his proposals, at the end of the proposal, but why take our word for it? Here are a list of people we've done similar work for, and while we don't usually disclose who our clients are, I have their permission in this case to use their names, and feel free to speak with them and ask how we did, whether or not we helped them. And he was always after us, never to be self-promotional. Whenever, if you had a meeting around the table to discuss a client's needs, which is usually called a request for qualifications meeting, when they say, how are you qualified to help me? Chet would always take the lead, but he was always very controlling about not letting somebody start saying, oh, well, I've done that before. We know how to do that. Here's who we've done that for. Chet would always say, well, I seem to hear you saying that you have a problem about getting your senior management's attention. And Jim, you've had some experience with that, haven't you? How would you handle this? And that way he would keep you from starting to be self-aggrandizing or self-promotional, which he didn't want, because he felt it was a turnoff to clients. And he put that in virtually everything he did, and this all became very formative to me because it directed really the way I thought about how to do a business. In Chet's world, you began every letter with the word you. It had to be the subject, the first sentence in the letter, because he wanted us always to have the you perspective of the client or the person you're writing to. And I think rightly so. He would say, if you have to write the first sentence and you as the subject of the first sentence, then you have to say something in the first sentence that will be of value to the you that you're writing to. And he would say, that's what I want you to do. And all of his materials, whatever brochures that he had or anything, rather than going through the material and saying, our mission, our purpose, our clients, our people, he would always say, we don't want to say anything like that. This is not a brochure about us. This is a brochure about how we can help you. So if anything, it should say clients we have served, not our clients. And that helped really to shape my view about what a consultant does. Now, the business I'm in and the business that Chet was in is very different from what a public relations agency or a firm or an advertising agency would do. We don't represent clients in a public forum. We're not their advocate in a public forum. We work, in fact, internal to the organization that we're working with the top management of the organization to help them do the three things that management consultants do, which is to devise a strategy, to put the right structure in place to carry out the strategy, and then to put the right systems there to support the structure and the strategy. So for us, this means deciding what the problem or the problems are that the organization faces, what the best strategy is to meet that problem. Sometimes it involves changing the people. Sometimes it involves realigning the people. Sometimes it involves the fact that what the communications people are doing is not related to the business of the organization. That's a little bit scary. One of the things that I noticed in working with Chet was that Chet was very good at getting people to talk about what was on their mind. And he had a very effective way of doing this with the CEO. He would always ask them to say, well, tell me a little about your business. How do you make your money? And he had always very carefully researched the company. He never went in anywhere without having done all of his homework. And he would have a reason for doing this. And he might say, but now, wasn't there a problem with the plant that you have in Niagara Falls? Didn't I read once that you had a problem there? And he would get them talking about this, and then he would say, and then what? Now, how did the PR people handle that? He would ask in that way to get them to talk more, because what he wanted to do was to have them feel like, first of all, this was somebody who listens and pays attention and is interested in me and what I need and what I want. And he always tried to put it into the best, most positive construct that he could. And maybe the second new business call I ever went on with Chet was to Firestone Tire and Rubber. And Firestone had a new CEO, and the CEO had come out of the automobile industry because Firestone's basic clients were the big three in Detroit and then the US government for selling their tires. And they didn't deal with the public very much. And this was the kind of assignment Chet liked. The new CEO, a man named John Nevin, decided he wanted to get into the aftercare market with cars. And for him, that meant he wanted to buy a chain of existing auto service centers that had been had been owned at that time by the J.C. Penney company, and J.C. Penney wanted to get rid of them. So there were 1,700 of these service centers around, whereas the Firestones were all dealer franchises, the existing Firestone stores. And the Firestone stores just depended on Firestone promotion to drive business to them. So now suddenly he owns a chain of what amount to retail outlets, and Firestone had not been a retail company. And he's very unhappy with the way things are going. And so as he describes to us his problems, it turns out he's a former journalist. And one of his problems was, he says, nobody in this place can write. And he said, they send me stuff up here that if in Philco, when I was running Philco for Ford, he said, if somebody had sent something like that to my desk, I would have written a note across it that said, you're fired, and sent it back to them. And he said, I don't think anybody down there can write. I also don't think they can proof. And he said, I need help here. And he said, so the first thing I'd like you to do is figure out, am I right or wrong? Can these people write and I just don't know it? Or what? I don't think they know what kind of, what to expect out of me. And of course that was true. The people who were there had been in place a long time. They were terrified of the new CEO. And they didn't get any direct feedback from him. They didn't know why. He just wouldn't use the stuff they sent them. And so they weren't communicating with each other. We spent time talking to them, and then Chet came back up and he said to Mr. Nevin before we left, well, I think we can help you. I've spent some time talking to the people in your public relations shop, and he said, and I think we can help you. And he said, but it's going to be, it may result in some dislocation of resources and some changes. If that's all right with you, I'd like to send you a proposal. Mr. Nevin said, that'll be fine. And Chet said, but let me ask you one thing. He said, before I go, because I always like to find something positive. Is there anything that the public relations people do that you like, that you approve of? I'd like to know what that is. Mr. Nevins thinks about this for a minute, and he finally says, if I'm going to be making a speech, or if I'm going to have a press conference or anything, they always have a glass of water up there on the podium for me, and it doesn't have any ice in it. And he said, that's just the way I like it. And he said, that's good. So as we were leaving, Chet said, I'm going to have a real problem with this one. He said, I don't know that he really knows what it is he wants out of the public relations department. He sees them as a bunch of writers, and he doesn't like the way they write. And the thing he does like is that they meet his personal need to have a glass of water. Here's a guy who his expectations are much too small for what he should be getting, and he doesn't know how to use them. And of course he was right. As we got into the case, it became clear that what had happened here, as we would all see quickly today, is that this company had reinvented itself when it bought the 1,700 auto service centers and tried to morph them into the already existing brand. It was basically an original equipment manufacturer that suddenly had a consumer-based business. But nobody had explained any of that to the communications people, nor did they know they were supposed to be doing anything any differently. Mostly they worried about 3 or 4 magazines, and they sponsored the Firestone 500, and they carried on car activities, golf tournaments and so on, and that's what they had been expected of them in the past. So Mr. Evans didn't know how to explain his changed expectations. They didn't know how to read the tea leaves. And it was really a case of my watching Chet sort of do his alchemy in this, which was to basically in time propose that a special position be created for the person who had been running corporate public relations, that they recruit someone who had the background and the skills to be able to deal with the retail side of the business, and they would have to therefore rebuild the staff in the organization. Well, I learned a lot just from working with him on that case, and I can say that as I continued to work with him throughout really the 80s, I continued to learn. But most of all, I think I just learned again and again and again how important were the principles that he operated on and the way he saw things functioning and focusing. So I've enjoyed a good experience and a good career in this, and it's given me a chance really to, I know, make a difference in some very big companies and some large organizations by simply learning to listen, being very good at identifying problems, trusting my intuition sometimes, and always remembering, I think the most important sort of rule of Chester Berger is that nobody is going to pay you a lot of money to tell them what they're doing wrong. They already know they're doing something wrong, and mostly they have bits and pieces of what it is, but no, they know it's not working. And if you feel like your mission is to get all self-righteous and start lecturing them or telling them how wrong all of this is or how bad all of this is, you're going to turn them off. And he said, my goal always is to make a change. My goal is to have something be better after I've been involved there, and I know a part of that is psychology. And it's not by making people feel inadequate or off the track as much as it is by getting to the meat of it, which is, but what can we do about this? Then what can we do to improve this? And making concrete suggestions. Chet's reports and things, the recommendations would be the beginning of the report. And then what consultants call the verbatims, the excerpts from interviews and the findings that we got would be almost like an appendix at the back, because he didn't want to begin a review of a project by digging into everything that was wrong. So that became my guiding light as well. I would always look to say then, what are we doing here that's good, but now what could be done better? What could we do to improve it?